What's happening, y'all? Thanks so much for logging in. Let's worship tonight. Sing, He's coming on the clouds. He's coming on the clouds. Kings and kingdoms will bow down, and every chain will break as broken hearts declare His praise. For who can stop the Lord Almighty? And our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles, and every knee will bow before Him. And our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world, and His blood breaks the chains, and every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb, and every knee will bow before Him. So open up the gates, make way before the King of Kings, the God who comes to save. He's here to set the captives free. For who can stop the Lord Almighty? Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles, and every knee will bow before Him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world, and His blood breaks the chains, and every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb, and every knee will bow before Him. So who can stop? Who can stop the Lord Almighty? And who can stop the Lord Almighty? Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Oh, who can stop the Lord Almighty? And who can stop the Lord Almighty? Oh, who can stop the Lord Almighty? And who can stop the Lord? Oh, hey! Oh, our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles, and every knee will bow before Him. And our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world, and His blood breaks the chains, and every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb, and every knee will bow before Him. Sing. I needed a rescue, my sin was heavy, but chains break at the weight of Your glory. I needed shelter, I was an orphan. Now You call me a citizen of heaven. When I was broken, You were my healing. Now Your love is the air that I'm breathing. I have a future, my eyes are open, 'cause when You called my name, oh, I ran out of that grave, oh, out of the darkness into Your glorious day. Oh, You called my name.
Hey, Church of Nolensville student family, it's Alex here, your student pastor. Welcome to Nolensville Students Online, part of our hashtag Can at Home series. You joined me in a bit of a funk. I was bored this weekend. I'm usually not bored. I've got a wife and a daughter. Been serving you guys as a student minister. I've got a house to maintain. We talked about mowing the lawn last week in my devotionals. I'm always busy, but this last weekend, I got bored. Not like I'm going to weigh the pros and cons on how badly I want to get that thing done. That's just called laziness. I'm talking about boredom. But there was one shining glimmer of hope. Every week since this whole thing started, me and a few of your student leaders, Marty, Nick, Mary, my wife, myself, we actually watch pretty epic movies on Netflix together by syncing them up at the same time and pushing play while on a Zoom call. And basically it's just a contest to see who can make everyone else laugh during the serious parts. But it's been a really fun way to stay connected with our friends, and I highly recommend it if you haven't done it already or tried it. But I think the next movie that I'm going to pick has got to be the movie Miracle. For those of you who haven't seen it, check it out. It's on Disney Plus now. Great app. I used to live in Minnesota. I used to play hockey, and this was definitely something that I picked up on and began loving when I lived up there. It's a pretty old movie to you guys, but it's not to me and maybe your parents. But basically what happens is this movie takes place in 1980 during the heart of the Cold War, which if you've been in history class, you might know that it was when the USSR, modern-day Russia, and America were in a chess-beating contest about who could dominate the world if we wanted to. Basically, we argued and tried to beat each other on technology. They beat us to space. We beat them to the moon. They beat us to nuclear power, but we beat them to nuclear bombs and stockpiling. So anyway, we decided one particular winter that we had just gotten stomped by them in hockey in the former Winter Olympics, and so we said, you know what, America, let's go beat them there too. The problem is that the 1980 USSR hockey team is still, to this day, argued to be the greatest hockey team of all time. Every last name ended with Ov, and they were all incredible. So what did they do? They picked up a coach named Herb Brooks. He didn't have a ton of experience coaching a team like this, but he had a different way of looking at things. He said that instead of sending NHL players over to wage war against the Soviets, let's grab a bunch of college students together and try the same thing. He thought if we could get a bunch of guys with some skill and everything to lose, that we'd get more out of them than if we had people with all the talent and nothing to lose. And so the problem began right in the beginning. He had made this promise that we are going to beat the Soviets. We're going to beat the USSR. Only the team didn't really understand what they were trying to accomplish. And he grabbed all these college students after they had just gotten done playing in their national tournament. And so they're all butting heads against each other. These are from rival schools like Boston College, University of Michigan, and the U of M, Minnesota. And these guys are all going at each other's throats. They're not connecting, and it's going horrible. There's no progress toward the promise that Herb Brooks made to the committee that they were going to go beat the Soviets. And these are some of the themes that we've wrestled with lately, because we talked about identity. We've talked about that there's power in a name. And the problem was that these guys, they weren't coming together and they weren't seeing themselves as a team. They said, I'm from Boston College, I'm from University of Minnesota. And they were at each other's throats from old rivalries rather than working together. Now, we talked about not wasting your worth. These guys were wasting their time arguing. They were given so much responsibility and value to be on this team, and they squandered it by being at each other's throats all the time. They trained with each other for a year, and they still didn't really see any progress. And if you're like me, when you got into your Zoom group and you started reading about Romans 8:28, where it says that we know that all things work together for good, that those who love God, and for those who are called according to his purposes, that was all good and well, and it gave us maybe a glimmer of hope, or maybe it just frustrated you because you instantly turned off YouTube, you turned over to your Instagram or TikTok app, and you just went back to coping with the same old thing, because we're still all living in this COVID reality, which doesn't really feel like we're making any progress towards this good promise that we've been given. And so it becomes extremely frustrating. I speak with you guys, and we're all just frustrated with this lack of progress that we're making. I hear you guys talk about wanting to get into the Bible more. And then you ask me, are there any tools that you can just give me an easy button to press that makes it just, I can just show up and the Bible just makes sense, or it's exciting and encouraging to me the minute I open it. Others of you are just convicted and you're just frustrated and you're sharing with me, man, I've tried and I've tried and I've tried to get in the Word and nothing's happening. Either I don't get anything out of it, or one or two mornings I get in, and then the next morning I decide, I'm not going to school. I've got all day, so I'm just going to open up Instagram for the first hour I'm awake, or TikTok or whatever. And so I want to challenge you by saying that if you want to experience something new in your faith, you have to do something new. And if you look in Romans 12:2, it says something very similar. It says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good and pleasing and perfect will. Okay, so this is where it gets a little bit frustrating, because we see that first part, the patterns of this world, and my promise to you is this, that the patterns of the world are what are keeping you, it's wedged in that gulf between promise and progress. The patterns of this world are wrecking your progress, because the problem is that you've just spent years of your life creating patterns that are based on going to school, doing homework, being involved in sports, being a part of a certain friend group. And now you've been dumped into your home where all those patterns have been disrupted. And that's why it can feel so frustrating. Have you ever heard of the term rehab? It's literally a place where people who are addicted to substances and other things go to get unaddicted. Now, how do you suppose they do that? They pull them out of the environment where those habits were created, and they put them in an environment where they're forced into making new habits. And so all of us are in a scenario where we find ourselves in a COVID rehab from our old patterns. And now you have two options. Your first option is to create new unhealthy patterns. The other option is to make healthy ones. Because see, what happens is that habits become rhythms. And habits that become rhythms started as choices. And so we begin with choices. And anyone who's ever been addicted to something, who's had a bad habit, will tell you that at one time, and maybe they don't even perceive when it was, at one time, their choice no longer became a choice, at least not in their mind. Because choices become habits, like I said, and those habits eventually become automatic. And then our automatic responses to situations eventually becomes our character, our identity, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago. You see, this COVID thing, we've been in it for a month officially now, the safer at home lockdown, as it were. The chances are that you have started new habits in this COVID rehab. And they started as choices, and they became habits. And pretty soon, and it only takes 21 days, it becomes automatic. Now, maybe it just started as a choice, like I said earlier. You could have read the Bible, but instead you laid in bed and pulled out your phone and checked out Instagram or TikTok or played Fortnite on your phone or whatever. And maybe it was just a choice one or two mornings. And then it became a habit. And then it becomes something that you literally wake up, you push the alarm off your phone, and you grab it, and in one motion, you're opening that particular app. Maybe every time you're bored and you realize it, you're getting up and walking to your pantry and grabbing some cookies, or going to the freezer and grabbing some ice cream. Maybe every time you feel lonely at night and have access to technology, you're opening up your computer and checking out sites, pornography, whatever. And those choices eventually become habits, and they become automatic. They become places that you teach yourself to go to cope with whatever it is that triggered it. The problem is that we're being called to be safer at home, but we're setting ourselves up in situations where we're no longer safe for our soul. We're losing that accountability. We're losing the connection with our community that keeps us on the straight and narrow. And for those of you that are part of this Christian community and you're struggling to make good habits, this is starting to feel like a sick joke, I'm sure. But I want to encourage you that whether you're giving up or you haven't tried, that there's encouragement in God's word about creating good habits, about progress coming from promises that God makes. If you'll turn with me to 1 Kings chapter 18, we're going to be in verses 41 to 45, and that's where we're going to hone in on how God moves through promises. The background of this story is that Elijah, who is a prophet of God, one of the few at the time, finds himself in a cold war of sorts with the prophets of a false god named Baal. Now, this other false god is very much a representative of the pattern of the world. He was the easiest false god to follow at the time because a lot of people were doing it. And in the same way, even within our Christian community, we're all making decisions based on some sins that we all agree are the ones that we're going to be okay with. And maybe it's gluttony, or maybe it's fame on social media, or maybe it's comfort through security and distraction on social media or video games. But we all decide that these things, these false gods, these idols, are going to be okay through this season. And eventually those habits become automatic, and they can eventually become a part of who we are. And so Elijah, understanding this, creates this challenge. And he says, we're both going to create altars to our gods. And whichever altar catches fire first, without us lighting it on fire, of course, that God is the true God. And so they set this up, and Elijah spends all morning mocking the prophets of Baal because their altar isn't lighting, and they're calling for Baal to light the altar. They're dancing, and they're trying chants, and they're proclaiming his goodness. And nothing's happening. And he had had enough, and he turned and he said, all right, God, do your thing. Boom, a tower of fire came down from the sky and lit this altar ablaze. And it was obvious which God was the one true God. And so then we find ourselves with Elijah proclaiming a promise that his God isn't just a God of fire and anger and judgment, but he is a God who nourishes, a God who replenishes, who loves. And what better way to show that in a desert than through a rainstorm? And so we pick up here in verse 41, where Elijah promises that rainstorm, and we see how God progressively moves through that promise. Let's go to verse 41. Elijah said to Ahab, go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a rainstorm. We won. We're good. Let's go celebrate. So Ahab went up to eat and drink, but Elijah went up to the summit of Mount Carmel. He bowed down on the ground and put his face between his knees. You may have seen people pray like this. Then he said to his servant, go up and look toward the sea. So he went up and looked, and he said, I don't see anything. There's nothing. So this happened 7 times. Elijah says, go back. And on the 7th time, he reported that there was a cloud as small as a man's hand coming from over the sea. And Elijah said, all right, go tell Ahab, get your chariot ready and go down so the rain doesn't stop you. He was saying a downpour's coming. So there was a promise and there was progress. But what changed? Well, let's take a look at what this scene looked like. So here is a picture of Mount Carmel. It's in Israel, and it is facing the sea. It's kind of a rolling hill that moves up to a cliff face that faces the sea. And so Elijah is probably somewhere up over here and praying, and he sends his servant up to the peak of that mountain to survey the land, to survey the sky, actually, to see and proclaim when the rain is coming that God has promised through Elijah. And so he, just like you and me, trying to approach God's promises for ourselves, he runs up. He goes, all right, God made a promise. Let's see the progress. Let's see God work. And he gets up there and he sees a beautiful day with not a cloud in the sky. Typically something we would appreciate very deeply here in Nashville, but here, this was not a good sign. It was a sign that God did not show progress in his promise. Okay? So he runs back down and he tells Elijah, hey man, I didn't see anything. This promise thing ain't working out. So Elijah said, go check again. Go check again. He goes, okay, got it. And he runs back up there. Nothing. And he runs back down. And now he's thinking, man, this is a sick joke. Maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe there's something wrong with God. No, that can't be. I just saw him do that really big miracle. Well, maybe he's an angry God and not a nice God. Yeah, that's it. He gets down there. He says, God made a promise. Go back. Okay. And so he does this 7 times. And he's doubting and he's accepting and he's hoping. His faith is waning at times, I'm sure. Until finally he sees that cloud out in the distance. And he comes back and he has the faith to say, you know, I did see a cloud. I saw some progress. And now, in most of us in that scenario, I think, even if we drew something out of God's word that was a little bit exciting, I think our temptation would be, that was a fluke. That doesn't mean anything. It'll be the same thing tomorrow. It'd be nothing. That little cloud isn't going to cause a downpour. It's not going to cause a rainstorm. But he had the faith to come back and tell Elijah, man, I saw something. It's coming. And so you see, Herb Brooks, he tapped into the same thing with that team. He noticed something, and we're going to get to it in just a minute, that servant experienced. Because he did coach that team to beat the USSR in the 1980 Winter Olympics. But the most significant moment in that team's history actually came in a piddling game against a ragtag small team from a small country who had no business meddling in that tournament. It was an exhibition game, which is kind of like a practice, and they ended up tying this small team, a team that they should have clobbered. And so Herb says, hey, you guys aren't going to the locker room. Get on the red line. And he said, when I blow the whistle, you're going to go to the blue line and back, the red line and back, the other blue line and back, and then the far red line and back. And then we're going to talk. And they go racing across the ice. Remember, these guys just played hockey for like 4 hours. And so they do it, and they come back, and they're huffing and puffing. And he goes, again. What? Okay, all right. And they go back and forth and do this over and over and over again. And every time they return, and they're huffing and puffing harder, and he goes, again. And they have to do it over and over again. And they have no idea when this thing is going to end. It's kind of like COVID. We have no idea when this thing's going to end. And he brings these 20 of the world's most athletic men to their knees. They are falling off their skates and slamming into the wall. They're huffing and puffing. They're crying. They're sweating. They're hurling. They're bleeding on the ice. These guys are so tired. Until finally, a certain skater from Massachusetts calls out, my name is Mike. I'm from Massachusetts, and I play for the United States of America. And Herb looks at his boys, and he goes, that'll be all, gentlemen. You see, what Mike understood, what Herb understood, and what this servant understood, and what they experienced is that the mark of discipline, the results of faithfulness in something far greater than yourself, is the realization that the process is progress. Nothing changed on the ice that night. Sure, the house lights went down because the managers of the arena wanted them to go home. They were sweating a little bit more and they were a little bit more tired, just like that servant. But nothing truly changed in a significant way except for what went on in the souls of those two individuals. They understood how big of a thing they were a part of was. Mike realized what Herb was trying to teach these guys for a year, that the name on the front of the jersey that said USA was more significant than the name on the back. And in the same way, the servant realized that the size of that cloud means nothing compared to how great the faithfulness of God is. And so my encouragement to you is this: whether these new habits are hard or easy to make, whether you have bad habits that have been easy to make that you're trying to get rid of, my encouragement to you is the same as Herb Brooks. Just get up and do it again. Again. I'm not getting anything. Again. I have to fight this sin battle again? Yep, again. Man, this temptation's coming back again. Keep showing up. Because the difference between a false promise and seeing God's progress is the process by which He's changing you. You see, the process is the progress. God cares so much more about who He is shaping in you than what you're doing in one individual moment. Because one moment doesn't define a life. Your character does. Your faith does. So my encouragement is to get up and do it again. And so with that, we move on to the next section of our night. We've asked what God wants to teach us. Now we need to ask what we need to do about it. And in order to do that, we need to discuss in community what God is doing. Because just like that team, it wasn't until they unified under the guide that they were going to beat the USSR that they could focus, that they could move in the same direction. And so we need to gather in groups in order to move in the same direction, to encourage one another to get up and just do it again. And so we're going to do this in 3 parts. We're going to gather in groups to reflect on our last week, to ask what God is teaching us right now, and to make a plan for where we're going with that lesson. Now, we've been meeting in groups online through an app, through a program called Zoom. If you have not been a part of those things, I want you to email me at abuckler@thechurchatnolensville.com. Pause right now, make a note of that. If you don't get the chance to get into a group this week, I want you to gather your family. I want you to gather some friends on Zoom, and I want you to watch this video. These questions are made under the assumptions that you've seen it. And just discuss and make a plan and encourage one another to move forward in your faith. So let's jump into the questions real quick, and so I can empower you to go into your groups. So first, we need to get to know who you are, if you're new to the group especially. Then we want to move into asking the question, when have you been the most proud of your own progress, your own process? Was it through a sport? Was it through a challenging subject in school? Just tell us about it. And then you can answer one of these 2 questions. What has Jesus taught you this week? Or have you had a gospel conversation? That is, have you had a significant conversation with somebody? Have you talked about Jesus with someone who doesn't necessarily know Jesus? That's a gospel conversation. They are happening even in the midst of COVID, I promise you. So now we're going to move on to what God's teaching us tonight. One of the things that Herb Brooks was quoted saying that night as his players were huddled up on the ground, sweating and puking their guts out after running, skating back and forth in what we actually now call Herbies. He said this: "Common men, they go nowhere. You must be uncommon. You must be extraordinary." So, I want to ask you, how is it that Christians are uncommon? How are Christians empowered to be extraordinary? And I want you to read, as a group, Ephesians 3:16 through 19 to answer those questions. We have to go to God's truth to understand what He wants us to believe about this, because this is a true thing. We are uncommon. We are empowered to extraordinary things. But you need to know it. So, finally, what is our united goal as Christians? That team could not unite under the umbrella of just surviving as a group of teammates. They had to have a common mission. And in the same way, the church is just surviving as a group of people who gather together if they're not on a common mission. So we need to know what that is. What is our united goal as Christians? Whether you're sitting at home, stuck in COVID, or we're back and we're in our buildings and we're in our schools. What is our mission? You need to read 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 17 to 21 to figure that out. And then finally, we want to make a plan going forward. What's your one takeaway from tonight? If I called you at 2 a.m. and woke you up and you had one sentence to tell me what you learned tonight, what God is teaching you, what would that be? Finally, how can we be praying for you? We genuinely pray for you. Your group leaders pray for you, and I pray for you, and our other leaders pray for you. We want to know what's going on in your life. What do you need God's extraordinary strength in? What unified mission do you need help on? And then finally, who in your life needs to hear the good news of Jesus? That right there, if nothing else, is your mission over this next week. So come up with that name and let us encourage you and pray for you and empower you toward that end. Until then, go in grace and peace and love and serve the Lord.